establishing central influence and preparing for piece development, aiming to control key squares. Developing the knight toward the center anticipates central pawn expansion and prepares for queenside castling. Establishing central influence, this thrust immediately contests the d5 square and opens diagonals for queen and bishop. Black establishes a solid pawn structure, preparing to develop their bishops and challenging White's central grip. Bolstering the center's pawn chain, White prepares for central control and a flexible development of pieces. Solidifying the center, this move directly contests the pawn structure and opens lines for active piece development. Solidifying the center and developing another knight prepares for rapid queenside expansion and increased pressure on Black's pawn structure. Immediately challenging the central pawn structure, this piece development aims to disrupt White's harmonious setup and prepare for active piece play. Breaking the central pawn chain offers dynamic exchanges, but be mindful of freeing Black's pieces. Re-establishing central pawn presence solidifies Black's structure and opens diagonal for the bishop. Developing the bishop here pins the knight, creating immediate pressure on Black's queenside and preventing a simple freeing maneuver. White aims to exploit the pawn structure and potential weaknesses that arise from this pin. Developing the knight to d7 establishes a solid defensive network, reinforcing the d5 pawn while preparing to potentially support a c6 pawn advance, which could challenge White's queenside space. This maneuver offers flexibility, allowing for future transposition into various Indian defenses or maintaining a robust pawn structure. Solidifying the center and preparing a kingside fianchetto, White calmly reinforces their pawn structure while aiming to activate the bishop on g2, creating a harmonious setup that discourages Black's immediate central breaks. Challenging the central pawn structure, Black injects immediate tension, aiming to disrupt White's harmonious development and create an open game where their knights can become more active. This bishop finds a quiet outpost on d3, eyeing the kingside and preparing for queenside expansion. It's a patient placement, not immediately challenging anything, but setting the stage for future piece play and a potential kingside attack. A bold dive into tactical waters, this queen sortie immediately challenges White's pawn structure and aims to disrupt the harmonious development of White's pieces. It creates immediate threats, forcing a reaction and potentially exposing weaknesses if White isn't careful. A subtle repositioning, the queen now eyes the queenside, potentially supporting a kingside thrust later or simply bolstering control over the c-file. Securing the monarch initiates a period of relative calm, allowing development to catch up before the central storm fully breaks, a prudent measure given the exposed queenside and White's central pawn mass. Fortifying the king's sanctuary is paramount after a pawn sacrifice to disrupt Black's center. This maneuver ensures the monarch is shielded from any immediate tactical incursions and prepares for a potential central pawn push or development on the kingside. Black immediately seizes the initiative by aggressively expanding on the queenside, forcing White's bishop to retreat and creating a pawn outpost that threatens to choke White's development. This bold pawn thrust is a clear signal of Black's ambition to dominate the queenside majority. Targeting the weakened light squares around Black's king, the bishop now occupies an aggressive diagonal, ready to exploit any overextension by the pawn chain. Opening the e-file for the rook is a timely action, aiming to dislodge the intruding bishop on f5 and reclaim central influence, while also preparing to contest the d-file if White's queen ever vacates it. Developing the knight to d2 actively redirects its power towards the queenside, preparing to bolster the c3 pawn and potentially support a future b4 push while simultaneously freeing up c3 for another piece, perhaps a rook, to join the fight on the open c-file, adding significant pressure against Black's consolidated pawn structure. Proposing a potentially precarious pawn structure with g6, Black aims to contest the light squares, particularly the diagonal leading to their castled king, though it weakens the dark squares around the king, creating potential targets for White's pieces down the line. Clearing the immediate tension, White exchanges a bishop for a knight, a decision that immediately alters the pawn structure and opens up possibilities on the d-file, potentially influencing central control and creating lasting weaknesses for black if not handled with precision. Reclaiming the knight to its original square strategically solidifies black's central presence, untangling pieces, and preparing for a more dynamic regrouping of forces by offering a knight exchange that simplifies the position slightly while simultaneously bolstering the defense of the e6 pawn and potentially opening lines for future queenside expansion. Demanding the queen's retreat, white initiates a strategic repositioning, aiming to solidify central control and potentially prepare for a kingside pawn storm. Black exchanges off a defender of white's central pawn structure, aiming to simplify the position while maintaining a slight initiative due to white's doubled pawns on the queen side. Opening the b-file with this capture irrevocably alters the pawn structure, creating a doubled pawn on the c-file which, while potentially a weakness, also provides crucial support for the central d-pawn and opens a clear avenue for the rook. Consider how this newfound open file might be exploited later to penetrate black's position, potentially targeting the weak pawns on the queen side. The immediate challenge for white is to consolidate the structural changes and prevent black from fully exploiting the temporary disarray. Black repositions the knight to b6, aiming to exert pressure on white's queenside pawn structure while simultaneously preparing for a potential outpost on c4 or even d5. This maneuver seeks to challenge white's control of the central squares and introduce dynamism into the position. The knight's new placement also offers a clear line for the queen to potentially redeploy along the a5-d8 diagonal, adding to white's defensive considerations. It's a move that subtly shifts the initiative, forcing white to carefully reevaluate defensive responsibilities. Fortifying the kingside pawn structure, white attempts to solidify his king's sanctuary against the potential invasion of black's active pieces, while simultaneously blocking the dangerous bishop on b4's former diagonal and preparing to potentially advance the e-pawn. Unlocking the queen's rook file for potential penetration requires careful piece placement, and this maneuver perfectly sets up that possibility by clearing the path for the rook to potentially swing over. Re-establishing the rook on the open e-file immediately signals white's intention to contest control and potentially create pressure against black's king, especially considering the recent pawn push g6, which has weakened the dark squares around it. Challenging white's bishop on f5, this maneuver initiates a critical pawn race on the queen side, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially gain an open c-file for black's rook. Reclaiming the central square for the queen, this maneuver signals a potential re-evaluation of white's queenside initiative, aiming to unpin the knight and prepare for a more active role, possibly supporting a pawn advance or offering a trade on the d7 knight, seeking to simplify and eliminate black's influential piece. The bishop retreats, seeking a more active diagonal, but simultaneously surrenders the vital c4 square which can now be occupied by white's knights or pawns, potentially cramping black's position further. Launching the rook to a2 feels like a bold repositioning, aiming to challenge the bishop pair's influence on the queen side while subtly preparing for a potential invasion on the c-file or even an adventurous maneuver towards the king side. This rook lift is not merely about occupying a file. It's about creating flexible threats and potentially outmaneuvering black's well-placed pieces, especially the active bishop on a4. It signifies a shift in white's focus, perhaps anticipating a pawn push from black on the queen side, or seeking to disrupt black's harmonious development with unexpected activity. The rook's repositioning to the e-file offers better defensive coverage for the king side and prepares for potential central action, subtly reinforcing black's piece harmony while white's queenside remains somewhat disjointed after the pawn structure alteration. A patient repositioning, the knight abandons its pinning post on f3, seeking greater influence on the king side, potentially preparing a future jump to g3 or h2 to reinforce the monarch's safety as black's pieces swarm the center and queen side, creating a subtle shift in the battlefield's dynamics. Black repositions the rook to the central file, bolstering its presence and preparing for potential advances along the e-file, aiming to exchange pieces and alleviate white's pressure on the king side. Aggressively pushing the kingside, white initiates a daring pawn storm, aiming to pry open black's royal defenses and leverage the newly acquired space. This gambit of pawn advances, spearheaded by the h-pawn, seeks to exploit the potential weaknesses created by black's somewhat passive piece placement and creates a dynamic imbalance in the game. The knight's journey to the queenside, seeking a safe haven on c8, marks a strategic pivot after the pawn structure has been solidified by the recent exchanges. This repositioning aims to untangle the knight from the central congestion and potentially find a more active square on the b6 outpost or prepare for a future queenside expansion. It's a patient maneuvering, a subtle attempt to improve piece coordination amidst white's somewhat passive pawn push on the kingside. Realigning the knight towards the kingside hints at a latent attacking plan, aiming to outflank black's entrenched position on the queenside by potentially creating threats against the uncastled king's defenses. Pushing the f-pawn now is a bold attempt to break the suffocating positional grip white has established, aiming to create queenside counterplay or at least gain some breathing room for the pieces. But it significantly weakens the kingside dark squares, a potential target for white's bishop. The bishop, having completed its circuitous route, now aims to exert pressure on black's kingside, potentially eyeing weaknesses created by the pawn structure, while simultaneously defending against any immediate counterplay on the central files. Unlocking the queenside initiative, black aims to disrupt white's rook control and prepare a pawn storm with this knight repositioning. Exchanging the bishop on d6 strategically simplifies the position, removing black's active piece that was putting pressure on white's queenside and opening a pathway for the white queen to potentially infiltrate. Reclaiming the bishop's diagonal control while simultaneously preparing to contest the d-file is the immediate, double-barreled aim of this rook redeployment. Unleashing an attack along the kingside, white attempts to pry open black's defenses before the enemy can consolidate, hoping to exploit the slight immobility of the black queen and the somewhat exposed king position. Securing the queen's influence along the c7 square, this maneuver aims to liberate the knight on b6 and prepare its repositioning to a more active role, potentially on d7 or even c4, to challenge white's control of the center. It also subtly hints at a future queenside expansion, creating a more robust pawn structure and limiting white's attacking potential on that flank. Opening the h-file promises dynamic play, potentially exposing the black king, though it also grants your opponent counterplay along the now open lines. Reclaiming the open h-file is essential here, and this pawn push directly addresses that, aiming to create counterplay against white's potentially exposed king by opening lines. The knight's journey to the kingside aims to bolster the attack, eyeing the now exposed dark squares around black's monarch, while simultaneously preparing to support a potential pawn push on the kingside. Seeking to consolidate the queenside and potentially break free on the kingside, black now prioritizes centralizing the queen and offering it as a shield against white's immediate threats. Bringing the rook to the second rank fortifies the kingside and prepares to contest the e-file, a sensible maneuver to counter black's central pawn presence and potential threats. Reclaiming control of the c8-h3 diagonal offers the bishop a more active role, preparing to challenge white's pieces on the queenside and potentially support a kingside advance. Shifting the knight to this square aims to create a more flexible defensive setup, potentially rerouting it to support the kingside or even to exploit the weakened pawn structure on the c-file. Injecting a surge of activity, this maneuver aims to galvanize the queen and potentially create tactical opportunities on the kingside by bringing it closer to white's structure, forcing a reaction and preventing white from consolidating their queenside initiative. Re-establishing the queen's presence on the c-file aims to increase pressure against black's potentially exposed king, while also defending the pawn on c3 and preparing for potential pawn breaks on the queenside. Reclaiming the central files for potential breakthrough, this maneuver aims to reposition the rook for greater influence, perhaps anticipating a future pawn push or preparing for an exchange that could ease the pressure on black's position. Shattering the pawn structure around your king, white initiates a bold central confrontation, aiming to seize the initiative and open critical lines for his attacking pieces. This aggressive pawn thrust disregards immediate material considerations, prioritizing dynamic activity and the disruption of black's comfortable coordination. The aim is to create chaos and exploit any lingering weaknesses in black's defenses, potentially leading to a decisive attack if black doesn't react precisely. Opening the center with this capture suddenly injects sharp tactical possibilities, aiming to exploit the doubled pawns on the queen side and the exposed king. Seizing the central initiative, this knight maneuver opens a dynamic line for your queen and simultaneously threatens to collapse the opponent's queenside pawn structure, creating immediate discomfort and forcing a reaction. The king's escape route is now officially blocked, forcing it to navigate the remaining battleground with a significantly compromised safety net. Unlocking the d-file for penetration, white decisively throws open the center with this pawn thrust, aiming to expose black's somewhat passive king position and exploit the doubled pawns on the c-file that have become a significant weakness. Liberating the f8 square for the king, this pawn thrust opens lines and challenges white's initiative. Unleashing the knight to d6 creates a potent stranglehold on the d-file, simultaneously threatening the rook and eyeing further penetration into black's weakened queenside. Accepting the exchange dramatically simplifies the position, potentially leading to an endgame where black's doubled pawns on the queenside become a significant long-term weakness. Reclaiming the open file with the rook solidifies control, preparing for a potential advance of the central pawns or offering a defense for your monarch should the opponent try to exploit the weakened kingside. The rook's sacrifice, 35, Rxe2*, dramatically alters the board's dynamics, initiating a queen and pawn endgame. This aggressive exchange clears the d-file and offers a potential outpost for the black queen, but critically it concedes white's passed pawn on d5 and creates a very vulnerable pawn structure for black, especially on the king side. The ensuing king hunt will be paramount. The immediate recapture of the rook solidifies white's material advantage and initiates a potentially decisive endgame sequence, though black's remaining rook on the 6th rank still poses some passive pressure. A desperate search for counterplay erupts as the black queen descends from the heavens, seeking to disrupt the now overwhelming white position. The king's sudden exposure is a precarious development, abandoning the safety of its former castled fortress to wander into potentially active enemy territory. Proposing a strategic repositioning, the black king seeks sanctuary amidst the rising storm of white's offensive pieces. Bolstering the central pawn majority, white seeks to finally crack open the kingside and exploit the exposed monarch. Snatching that pawn seems tempting, but it exposes your king to a dangerous degree and ignores the immediate threat of white's doubled rooks and centralized queen. A more prudent approach would involve reinforcing your king's position or seeking counterplay elsewhere on the board before white can consolidate their advantage. Unleashing a potent royal assault, this check pierces the enemy's weakened defenses, forcing the black king from its protective circle. The black king, desperately seeking refuge, exposes itself further by venturing towards the queenside. Unleashing the queen to force the opposing king into an exposed position, this check aims to dismantle black's defensive structure and pave the way for a swift mating attack. The black king, having lost its protective pawn shield, now faces a perilous journey towards the center, hoping to escape white's relentless queen and knight pressure. Unleashing the queen to exploit the exposed black king, this move initiates a decisive attack by forcing the king into a more vulnerable position after the subsequent exchange.